All right, welcome back. We're back from our break. During the first hour, we spent some time going through the Old Testament, through the Hebrew Bible, in order to better understand the expectations of this promised messianic figure. We looked particularly at the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7 and a lot of the passages that came after that longed for the fulfillment of the Davidic covenant, which of course indicated that the Messiah was to be a descendant of David. He's to be a biological lineal descendant of David, and he was promised the throne in Jerusalem forever. He was going to have a house and a dynasty, be a builder of that house. And of course, he is someone that is going to have a kingdom forever. And all the peoples, not just the Jewish people, but all the peoples were to give worship and obedience unto this Jewish Messiah. So the Psalms, which is the hymn book of the Jewish people, would often speak about these messianic expectations because when you long for something, you typically sing about it or you include it in your worship because it's something that you want to happen. And so we see these themes about the Davidic Messiah and the Son of David and the Messiah's kingdom reappear within the book of Psalms. Excuse me. So we briefly looked at Psalm 2 last week, and I just kind of want to review a couple of those particular points that I think are interesting. In particular, and we're gonna, since we spent the time in Psalm 2 already, I'm not gonna go and look at all the details, but I want to just, for our list here, for our ongoing list, I do want to make sure that we mention some of the key impacts. So Psalm 2 indicates that we have Yahweh and his king, like his anointed king, his king, the anointed one. Okay, it's quite clear. So if the anointed king is called the anointed one, then clearly he is anointed by God. Um, the interesting thing is that we talk about the Messiah, and so the word in Hebrew for Messiah is Mashiach, which is actually related to the verb to anoint. Okay, the same thing is in Greek. In Greek, the noun Christ, Christos, is related to the verb to anoint. So obviously, the anointed one is someone who has been anointed. So who anoints the anointed king? Well, clearly that's God. That's Yahweh. Okay. We saw in verse 6 that that the anointed king is called God's king. It's my king. Clearly, the anointed one is a king. He's a ruler. And where is he going to be installed? He's going to be installed. Um, let's see who rules from Zion. Remember, Zion is the poetic way of referring to Jerusalem. Jerusalem. Okay. Why is it important that the Messiah rules from Jerusalem? Because the throne that is promised to David's descendant is geographically located in Jerusalem. It's the throne in Jerusalem. So that's why Zion there is the place of the installation of this king. Okay. Verse 7 indicates, of course, that at the installation of the king, when the king is installed, then he receives the title Son of God. And we also saw this, remember, in 2 Samuel 7:14, where God said, I will be his father, he will be my son. So God is the father of this king. The king is the son of God. Son of God is a title for the messianic king. That's important. Okay. So here, on the day when he is installed, it will be said, you are my son. Today I have begotten you. Or it's more literally, today I have become your father. There's not a sense of the king being born. Obviously, the king has been born for some time. The king just got installed. So the king is not coming into existence at this point. So this is a a fathering of the king, with the metaphor fathering, as in God is becoming the father, giving the king the title Son of God, as we saw in 2 Samuel 7:14. It's very important. Okay. Verse 8 indicates that God will give the nations as the king's inheritance, the very ends of the earth as your possession. So he's going to be a ruler of the nations. Let me actually look at the Hebrew there. Yeah, the goyim. Okay, so the word for nations in Hebrew is actually the word for Gentiles. Okay, he's going to be ruler over the Gentiles, and he will rule the entire earth. Okay, and again, you're already hearing the echoes from the promises that were made to Adam. Adam was to subdue and to rule over the entire earth. Adam lost that privilege because of his sin, and now it's being regained through this messianic figure. Okay, very important. Okay, the king is going to break them with a rod of iron. What's actually interesting is that so the Old Testament is written in Semitic languages. It's written in Hebrew and Aramaic. But once Alexander the Great had taken control over Palestine, he brought with him Greek language and Greek culture. And so the Jews started to speak Greek. They started to learn Greek, and they understood that if everybody's speaking Greek, we need to have a Greek translation of our scriptures. And so they translated all of the Old Testament into Greek. And that Greek version, which is called the Septuagint, that actually was the Bible of the early church. It was just a Greek translation of the scriptures. So in the Greek, where it says, "You shall break them with a rod of iron," it uses this verb "pimeno" right here, which actually means to shepherd or to rule. It's interesting. So from their perspective, the king is to shepherd and to rule the nations with a rod of iron, which is a less threatening image than breaking them with the rod of iron. The rod of iron is something that the rod is, the shepherd. The shepherd has a rod, and what does he do? He shepherds, he guides, he nurtures, and he helps out the sheep. So it's a much more positive image, but it's also a ruling image because David was a shepherd king. Okay. Um, and we saw that that in verse 11 that Yahweh is given worship with reverence and rejoicing, but also the Son of God, is receiving homage. And in Hebrew, the verb means to kiss. You kiss the Son. So we can see that the Son of God is worthy of worship. But the worship is distinguished from the worship that is given to Yahweh, to the true God. Yahweh is given worship and reverence. Here, the Son is given homage. It's a kiss sort of worship. Okay, so we can see there. And again, all those titles, we know that the Messiah is the same as the title Christ, which is the same as the title Son of God. Um, and that's also the king. Okay, and it could, as you see here in verse 12, um, it could just be abbreviated as the Son. Okay, so that's very important. Okay, but again, nothing there is new. All of those little themes we've already picked up from the other passages in the Old Testament. So Psalm 2 doesn't really give us anything brand new. It just reiterates all of those points, but they're very important. They're very important. Okay, so let's move to Psalm 45. Psalm 45. Okay, so this is an interesting psalm because it seems to be, as you read through it, it is a psalm that is sung directly to the king on his wedding day, on the day of when the king is going to have a bride that's presented to him. And so this particular king, it's a lot of people think that it was originally in reference to Solomon. Solomon was the king that came after King David. But it tells us a lot about the understanding of this messianic king, this Davidic king. And the New Testament writers will draw quite heavily from this particular psalm in their depiction of Jesus the Messiah. So Psalm 45 is very interesting. So look at how this works. At the very beginning, verse 1, um, it says, for the choir director, it's a maskil of the sons of Korah. None of that really matters for us. Notice it's a song of love. My heart overflows with a good theme. I address my verses to the king. My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. So right from the beginning, we can already see that the king, this is the Davidic king, um, that songs are sung to the king. Okay. It's interesting. We tend to think that songs of worship should only be sung to God. But here in the Old Testament, there's an entire psalm that is sung directly to the king. And it's a love song. Okay. So human beings can be the recipients of song and worship. Okay. And that's fine. That's okay. All right. What else do we learn here? And you see all these flattering things that are said about the king. You are fairer than the sons of men. Grace is poured upon your lips. Therefore, God has blessed you forever. Okay. Clearly, uh, let's also point this out. If God has blessed the king, so we're to say God has empowered the king. Okay. Um, empowered slash blessed. Is empowered and blessed king. How has God empowered and blessed the king? Gird your sword on your thigh, O mighty one, in your splendor and your majesty. Now, if you're able to read the Hebrew, it's very interesting. We have a couple of words here. We have the word splendor and majesty. Okay. And these words for splendor and majesty in Hebrew are very interesting because they are actually attributes of um, the God of Israel. So I'll just you kind of hold your spot there in Psalm 45. Let me click a different tab for this. Let's go. Let me check my notes because I don't have this memorized. 104 verse 1. Yeah. Okay. So in Psalm 104, verse 1, it says, bless the Lord. That's bless Yahweh, O my soul. O Yahweh, my God, you are very great. You are clothed with, same words there, splendor and majesty. Okay. Um, okay. So splendor and majesty, they are attributes of God. Okay. They're God's attributes. But what do we see in Psalm 45? We see the previous verse, God has blessed the king. And look, the king now has splendor and majesty. You know what that means? That means that God has shared his attributes with the human king. Okay? God has empowered the human king to share in God's attributes. It's a very important point. Okay? The splendor and majesty, those belong to God, but God has blessed the king. And now look, the king now has the things that are formerly associated with God. It's a very important point. Okay. Is there anything in here that's really interesting? Okay. Verse 6 is actually very, very important about this particular king. Notice what is said about the particular king in verse 6. It says, your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of uprightness is the scepter of your kingdom. I'm going to read the next verse here. Okay. Verse 7. You have loved righteousness and hated wickedness. Therefore, God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. What is going on there? What is actually happening? Here's what's happening. Okay. The Davidic king is called God. Okay. However, he still has a God above him. You see in verse 7, it addresses the king. It says, therefore, God, your God has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows. Okay. So the Davidic king is not confused with the God who has blessed him. He still has a God that ranks above him at this point. Okay. But we're seeing just as God has empowered the king, God has blessed the king, God has shared his attributes with this king. Another thing that God shares is his own title. Okay. Because remember, God is not God's name. God is actually a title. It's actually the God or the deity. Okay. Because God's name is not God, God's name is Yahweh. Okay. So this is God sharing a title. Um, title, yeah. Shared by the true God. Okay. Some translations, by the way, will actually put a lowercase g God in reference to this king here in verse 6. Okay. Just to kind of make the distinction between that. So this is important. It's important to know that this king is blessed. He's empowered. He shares in God's attributes, and he's actually called God, but not in a way that confuses him with the true God. Okay, so he's called God in verse 6 and in verse 7, where it says, "Therefore God." But then it says, "Your God has anointed you with the oil of joy above your fellows." Okay, so again, some high and exalted things that again were originally said about Solomon. Solomon was called God, but not in a way that confuses Solomon with the true God. Okay. All right. What else is said about him? There's, I mean, all these flattering, poetic things that are said about him. Um, let's see. Actually, it turns in verse 10. Listen, O daughter, give attention, incline your ear. The king will desire your beauty. Notice, because he is your Lord, bow down to him. Okay. So here we can see that the king is your Lord. Okay. Now again, this is not the capital Lord, Lord, that is the name of God. This is a title of authority, a title of prominence that is given to the king. Well, quite clearly. So the king is the Lord, who, by the way, who is worthy of worship. Okay, we've already seen that. We've already seen that the messianic figure, the Davidic king, is worthy of worship. So that's not anything new here. Okay, let me see if there's anything else in the psalm. People are going to give him good things. Um, da, 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 da. Yeah. Okay. The peoples will give you thanks forever and ever. He is the recipient of thanksgiving. Okay. So they can offer thanks. They can offer thanks to this particular king. So Psalm 45, that's all that we'll look at for Psalm 45. There's a lot of stuff in there. So what do we see here? We saw that you can sing songs to the Davidic king. The king is empowered by God. The king is blessed by God. The king receives God's attributes, splendor, and majesty. Um, the king is also the recipient of the title God, shared by the true God. The king also bears the title Lord. He is worthy of worship, and he receives thanksgiving and praise. Okay, that's a lot that's being said about Solomon. That's originally Solomon. Okay, let's look at Psalm 72. Psalm 72. Okay. All right. This is actually called a Psalm of Solomon. So it was thought that Solomon is actually the author of this particular psalm. So not all the psalms were written by David. Um, so that's the title that's actually given on Psalm 72. 72. All right. So look at what's said here in the first verse. Give the king your judgments, O God, and your righteousness to the king's son. What's going on right there? What's going on? We're seeing again God sharing his attributes and his privileges with the king, and not just the king, but with the king's son. Okay, God shares his and his roles with the human king, um, namely God's his ability to judge and his righteousness. Okay. Important point. Okay. And so now we see, may the king judge your people with righteousness and you're afflicted with justice. So of course the king is functioning there as the judge who's judging on God's behalf. Okay. Um, Mountains are bringing peace to the people, the hills and righteousness. What's he going to do? He's going to vindicate the afflicted, save the children, crush the oppressor. So he is if he's someone who saves the children, then he's a savior, um, savior who vindicates. So the Messiah is a figure of refuge, you could say. Okay, let me check my notes here. Okay, all right. All right, verse 8. May he rule from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. By the way, when it says the river, that's always the river Euphrates. Okay, so this human king, is going to he's going to have worldwide dominion. Okay, again, he's not just ruling Jerusalem. He's not just ruling Zion or Israel or Palestine. It's from the sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. Okay. All right. Now here's an interesting thing that it's one of these issues of translation. It says, "Let the nomads of the desert bow down to him, and his enemies lick the dust." Okay. And so this word here for the nomads of the desert, the nomads, it's this Hebrew noun, seer. Sea. Okay, but you can see there that the first definition is a wild animal. Okay, and every other place in the Old Testament where this noun appears, it refers to animals. It refers to animals in the desert. But for whatever reason, the translator here struggled to understand, why could it be that an animal would come and worship a king? Why would that happen? Why would that take place? And so they translate it as like the people of the desert, the nomads of the desert. Um, but the Hebrew word means an animal. Okay, and some translations actually say the animals of the desert. Um, so I actually think that's what the text actually means. Okay, so he is the recipient of worship. But we're actually saying that animals worship the human king. Okay, and this is no surprise, because remember that Adam in Genesis chapter 1 was to have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every creeping thing that's on the earth. Okay, so all of the animals were under the dominion of a human being. And here in Psalm 72, we see the promised Messiah, the king, is supposed to have dominion over the animals. Okay, so again, it's just one of those interesting translation things. But you can see, because it looks so odd that this particular translator said that couldn't be right. It must refer to people, but it's not. Like the Hebrew noun in every other occurrence means animals. Okay. So I think that's interesting and fascinating. Verse 10, the kings of Tarshish and the islands will bring presents. The kings of Sheba and Seba will offer gifts. So now we're seeing that that even foreign nations, the nations, worship the human king. Important. Because, of course, he's ruling from sea to sea, from the river to the ends of the earth. All the kings will bow down before him. All the nations will serve him. We've seen this a lot. He's going to deliver the needy and the afflicted. So not only is he as a savior, he is a deliverer. Okay. What else do I think is interesting that's here? Okay, so here's another interesting thing in verse 17. It says, "May his name endure forever. May his name increase. It says, as long as the sun shines. Um, so in in this uh, this particular translation, whenever they put something in italics, that means that it had to be added to the text, and the translator is telling you they had to add that to the text in order to make sense of what is actually taking place. Okay. But what is really going on here? It says that may his name increase, um, and then it uses the preposition before. May his name increase before the sun. Okay. And so the translator thought, well, if it's before the sun, then it's before or kind of in the presence of the sun, kind of like, if you're before somebody, you're kind of there in their presence. And so they said, well, as long as the sun shines. Okay. But um, the word before, so let me just put the Hebrew down here. Um, May his name increase for the sun. Okay. Okay. But the preposition before, as it is in English, could mean two things. The word before could mean before, as in like in the presence of. It's a spatial sort of before, or it could mean before in time, as in like may his name increase prior to the sun. And there were many Jews that read this verse and they said, "Oh, the name of the Messiah was around prior to the sun, before the sun." Okay. And there's some ambiguity, and they made an argument that that was how it was supposed to be understood. And so, because of that, they would actually say, so this is going to be, let's put it, Jewish interpreters. Um, uh, the name of the Messiah pre-existed the creation of the sun. Okay. And this is what how at least the earliest Jews understood the concept of preexistence. Okay, that notice it's not the Messiah himself. Okay, because the Messiah was to descend from David. It's his name was to exist before the sun. Like God had already planned what his name was going to be. So I don't know if any of you have any children, but most parents they consider the name of their child before the child is actually born. I have a 2-year-old, and we had decided upon his name prior to him being born. So many Jews saw this passage as predicting the fact that the coming Messiah is going to have what actually was someone that was considered and thought in the plans and purposes of God from early times, from before creation, before the creation of the sun. Again, not the person of the Messiah, but just his name. May his name increase prior to the sun. So, again, I'm not saying that's exactly what the verse means. I'm saying that was a prominent interpretation of the passage by Jewish people. Okay. All right. Let's see. Okay, so that's pretty much the end. So a lot of interesting things there about the Messiah in Psalm 72. Again, we see he shares in the attributes and the role, or God shares his attributes and roles with the human king, particularly the ability to judge and God's righteousness. He's a savior. He rules from a worldwide perspective. Possibly animals are worshiping him, but most certainly the nations are worshiping him. He's a deliverer figure, and his name increases perhaps prior to the sun. So something to consider. Okay, a couple more from the Psalms. Let's look at Psalm 89. Psalm 89. Very fascinating psalm where we're going to continue to see the Davidic themes reappear. Psalm 89. Okay. All right. So let's start here in verse 1. I will sing of the loving kindness of Yahweh forever. To all generations, I will make known your faithfulness with my mouth. For I've said, loving kindness will be built up forever. In the heavens, you will establish your faithfulness. And then God responds, I have made a covenant with my chosen. I have sworn to David, my servant. Okay. So here we have the Old Testament alluding to other passages in the Old Testament. Okay. This is called intertextuality. Okay. So this is um, alludes to if God has made a covenant with David, we know that's alluding to 2 Samuel 7. Okay. We talked about how 2 Samuel 7 was the most influential passage, um, influential chapter for messianic thought. So here in Psalm 89, the passage goes, what is God going to do? I will establish your seed forever and build up your throne to all generations. So there you have the house, which is the dynasty forever. Okay. And the throne, where is that throne supposed to be? Remember the throne in Jerusalem forever. So God here is reiterating the promises that were made in the Davidic covenant. Okay. So, so it's praise to God, but also there is God responding in the psalm saying that, hey, I'm going to restore the promises that were made to David. It's going to happen. Okay. This is kind of a lengthy psalm, so we'll skip through a lot of it, but I'm gonna kind of again point out the highlights. The heavens will praise your wonders. Faithfulness is also in the assembly of the holy ones. Who in the skies is comparable to Yahweh? Who among the sons of the mighty is like the Lord? Among always like no one is like God. Even among the angels, no one is like God. He is awesome. Who is like you? You rule the swelling of the sea. When the waves rise, you still them. Here's an important thing that we're going to note in this particular psalm. Okay, so God rules the sea and the waves. Okay, very important. Okay, and he also stills them. All right, so God has authority over creation. Clearly, okay. You crushed Rahav, which is a poetic primordial enemy of God. You shattered the enemies. Heavens are yours. The world and all it contains. You founded them. And let's see here. Let's kind of skip down a little bit. Okay. Here, God, God has a strong arm. So this is the what's called anthropomorphism, to where they attribute to God human body parts. So to say that God has a strong arm, it means that God is mighty and God is powerful. And if God's hand is mighty, that means that God is able and willing to do good things. His right hand is exalted. The right hand was the hand which most ancient people would accomplish their works. They were right-handed persons. Okay. All right. God is a strong arm slash hand. Okay. Where is the part that's very interesting? Okay. All right. He returns to the David part here in verse 20. God says, I have found David, my servant. With my holy oil, I have anointed him. We can see there that the Davidic king is the anointed king there. With whom my hand will be established. My arm will also strengthen him. Okay. So here's something that's fascinating. Remember what we just saw? That that God has a strong arm and hand, but what does God do with his hand? Okay, God will strengthen the Davidic king. Okay, so God's arm is going to strengthen the king, meaning God's going to empower the king. God is going to authorize the king. Okay, so God is going to transfer his authority over to the Davidic king. Okay. Let's see. My faithfulness and my loving kindness will be with him. In my name, his horn will be exalted. We could say there, God, if God's faithfulness and loving kindness is with him, then God shares his faithfulness. And I'm not going to say loving kindness. I'm just going to, loving kindness is just another word for faithfulness. So God shares faithfulness with the king. But that's not the key thing. Okay, notice right here in verse 25, I shall also set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. Okay, remember who has authority to rule the waters, the seas, and the waves? We saw earlier that God does it. But God has a mighty hand, and God takes his hand and he empowers the king. And now look, God says, I'm going to set his hand on the sea and his right hand on the rivers. Okay. So God empowers the king to have authority over the waters, rivers, the seas, sort of thing. Okay. And that's important. So so the king shares in God's privileges and prerogatives and is able to have authority over nature. And how does the king have authority over nature? Because God has empowered him to do so. All right. He will cry to me, you are my father, my God, and the rock of my salvation. Okay. So again, if God is the father of this king, then that makes the king the son of God. Okay. So we've already seen this. We saw it in Psalm 2. We saw it in 2 Samuel 7. The Davidic king is the son of God. Okay. Um, God, of course, is his father. Okay. And then God says, I'm going to make him my firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth. Okay. Here's a title, firstborn. And firstborn it could mean a couple of different things, but in this particular context, firstborn means the highest king. Okay, and of course, the passage tells us that. It says the highest of the kings of all the earth. So the Davidic king is not just going to be one king among many, he's going to be the most important king, the most exalted king, the highest king of all the earth. Very important. My covenant will be confirmed in him. So the Davidic covenant will continue to be established through this particular king. I will establish his descendants forever and the throne as the days of heaven. So again, as we saw earlier here, um, the dynasty, the descendants, and the throne. So all those things continue to be reiterated in that psalm. So those are the main points we wanted to get out of that. So again, we're seeing the king is highly authorized by God. We see the Davidic issues there of the dynasty, the descendants that have to come from David. It's a Davidic descendant, excuse me. But also we're seeing that the throne is going to be forever, and God is empowering this king to share in God's own rule. God has authority over the waters and the seas. God takes his hand, puts it onto this Davidic king, and now the king has authority over it. Okay? Because God has empowered him. That's clear. All right. Now, we talked about how 2 Samuel 7 was the most influential chapter for Messianic thought. This passage, though, Psalm 110 and verse 1, is the most quoted passage, the most quoted verse from the Old Testament and the New Testament. It is alluded to dozens and dozens of times. I think it's directly quoted 23 times. So but when they do it, they quote it in reference to Jesus. Okay. So this is, again, it's a very, very influential passage for Messianic thought. Okay. So how does this work? Okay. A Psalm of David. Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. That's a lot to unpack there. Let's make sure that we understand what's going on here. Okay. We got two figures. Okay. We got Yahweh, and what does he do? He issues a summons. He speaks to this other figure, speaks to, quote, my Lord. Okay. And what does Yahweh say to my Lord? Okay. He says, come and sit at my right hand. Okay. So this second figure, which is understood by the New Testament authors to refer to Jesus. Okay. So from the New Testament perspective, it's going to be God He speaks to Jesus. And what does he say? Sit at my right hand. Okay. Now, where does God rule? Well, God rules in heaven. Okay. So this is summoning and exalting this second Lord figure, summoning him to heaven, exalting him, and installing him at God's right hand. Okay. That's important. So it indicates an exaltation, an enthronement. Okay. But what's interesting here is that this enthronement is different than the Davidic enthronement. And it's important to make this distinction in your mind. Okay. To sit at the right hand of God is not the same thing as ruling the Davidic throne in Jerusalem. Those are two different thrones in two different locations. Okay. So there have been some people that have interpreted and said, well, look, the Messiah is sitting at God's right hand. So that means that the 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 promises made to David of the throne being established forever are no longer valid, and I don't think that's actually true. The New Testament indicates that while Jesus has been exalted to heaven right now, he is still going to come back and occupy the throne of David forever. Okay, so it's important to make a distinction between enthronement in heaven. I put not to be confused with the Davidic throne in Jerusalem on earth. Okay. Um, so it's a simple distinction, but people have been confused with that. Now, the summoning of God is to sit at my right hand until there's an act of judgment. What is the act of judgment? Answer: until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Okay. Okay. So enthroned until God defeats the enemies of I'm just going to call him the second Lord figure. Okay. And to put the enemies under someone's feet. When you have your feet over an enemy, that's an image that you have dominion over your enemies. You're in charge. You have conquered your enemies. Okay. I don't think that the Messiah is going to sit back and have this footstool to where it's actually a pile of bodies. I think that's part of the metaphor that's there. The enemies being a footstool. But this verse right here, just this verse 1, is the most quoted verse from the Old Testament into the New Testament. Okay. I should put that here. Most quoted verse from the Old Testament in the New Testament. You can guarantee that will be a quiz and test question. Okay. That's really important. Okay. But it's clear there. We have Yahweh speaking to this other figure called my Lord. Yahweh invites him to his right hand, and Yahweh is going to defeat his enemies. And basically, Yahweh exalts this figure, and Yahweh puts the enemies under his feet. Okay, and the New Testament is quite clear. The second Lord figure is Jesus. So they interpreted that messianically. So it's interesting because it's a Psalm of David. It was understood that David was saying this about somebody else. David was saying this about his descendant. All right. Let's look at one more passage, and then we'll call it a day. We've kind of looked at a lot. I've kind of put a lot of information out there, but I think, again, what this does is it helps us to really fill in the expectation of the Messiah, what he's supposed to do, what's promised to him, what are his roles, what are his functions, and I think importantly, what is the Messiah's relationship to the God of Israel? Okay, so Psalm 132. Last psalm we'll look at today. Verse 1 says, remember, O Yahweh, on David's behalf, all his affliction. Okay, so when you have these psalmists saying, hey, God, I need you to remember David, remember what happened, remember David, this is recalling the Davidic covenant, and of course, all of those promises. So we should expect to see those things reappearing here. Okay, Remember David, how he swore to Yahweh and vowed to the mighty one of Jacob, surely I will not enter my house nor lie on my bed. I will not give sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids until I find a place for Yahweh, a dwelling place for the mighty one of Jacob. This is something that David did according to First Samuel. I think it's First Samuel, maybe Second Samuel. Okay. Let's skip ahead a little bit here. Okay. Verse 10. For the sake of David, your servant, do not turn away the face of your anointed. Okay. Remember that anointed figure? That's your Messiah, your anointed king. Okay. So on behalf of David, don't turn away this promised messianic figure. Okay. So there's a call to remember the anointed king from David's line. Okay. Again, this word for anointed in Hebrew, I can see it right there, is the word Mashiach, the word for Messiah. And in Greek, you can see it right there, is the word Christos, Christ. Okay. All right. Verse 11. Yahweh has sworn to David a truth from which he will not turn back. What is the truth? Of the fruit of your body, I will set on your throne. Okay. So we have a Davidic son. I mean, actually, from the fruit of David's body, will rule on the throne in Jerusalem. Okay. All right. So again, God is going to do this. God is promising that there's going to be a descendant. And again, the psalm, because it's having to ask and to worship and to basically pray for these things to happen, that would seem to indicate that the psalm was probably written after the Babylonian exile, when the Davidic king was temporarily suspended. So they're longing for this, saying, God, don't forget this. Don't forget these promises. You made these promises. And then, of course, the promises are reassured. It's reassuring that, yes, there will be a Davidic descendant. He will be set upon David's throne. If your sons will keep my commandment and my testimony, I will teach them. Their sons shall sit upon their throne forever. So again, we have the reiteration of the throne of David will be forever. Okay, and again, it's your sons, it's sons of David, David's descendants. Okay, Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his habitation. Again, Zion is Jerusalem, my resting place. God is going to dwell there forever. Okay. So we're seeing that. Remember, we talked about how 2 Samuel 7, very influential psalm. We can see that it gets discussed in a variety of these psalms. Definitely Psalm 2 with a lot of Davidic imagery. There's some empowerment of the Davidic king in Psalm 45. A little bit in 72, definitely in Psalm 89. Like the Davidic language is very strong there in 89, and definitely in Psalm 132. So it's interesting. A lot of these psalms, which people think they're just hymns to God. Some of them are much deeper. Some of them reiterate the messianic promises, and they tell us again about the job description of the king. Now, I don't think there's anything in those psalms, maybe a couple of points, that is brand new. All of those things we've seen in the previous passages. Okay. But as we start off and we discussed, when you go to the New Testament and you open the first book, the book of Matthew, it indicates that Jesus is the Messiah, the son of David, and the son of Abraham. And it doesn't tell you what those titles mean. It expects that you know what the son of David is and what the son of Abraham is. And now, after 2 hours of going through those texts, we can have a better feeling and an understanding of those particular points. And one of the things that Matthew is going to do, we'll talk about this in detail a little bit more next week, is that Matthew begins with a genealogy because it's very important. If you're going to say that Jesus is the Messiah, then what do you have to prove? You have to prove that, remember how the kings were supposed to descend from Judah? We saw that in Genesis 49. Okay. So what do you have here? Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob, and Jacob was the father of Judah. Okay. So it traces Jesus as coming through Judah. Why is that important? Because Judah was promised the scepter and the throne and the worship and the obedience of the peoples. Okay. We also know that from the line of Judah came David. Okay. What else do we see in Jesus' genealogy? Jesse was the father of David. And notice it's not just David, it reminds you it's David the king. David the king. And then from David, we have Solomon. Okay. So Jesus is a descendant of, he is a descendant of Abraham. So he qualifies as the son of Abraham. He's a descendant of Judah. So he qualifies as the king. He's also a descendant of David the king, continuing to qualify as the king. Okay. So by the time you get all the way down to it, they tell you that Jesus, again, has verse 16. Jacob was the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. So it proves that Jesus qualifies as the Messiah because he's a descendant of Abraham, he's a descendant of Judah, and he's a descendant of David. So most people, they look at those genealogical names and they think, this is boring, this doesn't mean anything to me. But it was important to prove that Jesus is this long-awaited Messiah by designating all of those names and proving that Jesus qualifies based on all of those responsibilities. Because remember, the Messiah had to be of the line of David. He had to be David's seed. He had to be the branch from David. All of those terms imply a lineal biological descendant. So that's why we needed to go through those particular points.